This is a wonderful time for me to be talking to you all, and I'm so grateful for the invitation. I just have submitted my book manuscript for this book called Playing with Things, the Moche Sex Pots. And so I'm going to try to present some excerpts from that book today. So first of all, what is Moche? Moche is the name that we give to a society that flourished on the north coast of Peru. Known for monumental architecture, fine metallurgy and ceramics, and spectacular elite burials. And it flourished for several centuries in the first millennium. Here's an example of one of these famous spectacular elite burials. So you can see there's all kinds of people, animals, objects, beautiful works of art. The main figure in the tomb was just covered in all of this gold and silver and finery. So these kinds of things have caught a lot of attention in the press. Moche is only one phase in a very long sequence of complex societies on the north coast. So the north coast of Peru is a very interesting place to look at the development of complex and unequal societies. We have very old evidence now for human presence, for early monumental architecture, even for the quipu, a kind of system of writing. Agriculture developed quite early, and canal irrigation also. So the Moche artists were also part of a very long tradition of very fine arts, especially metallurgy and ceramics. So an earlier society that's known for its ceramics is Cupisnique. And then after Moche, at the time that the Spanish came, they still encountered the Chimu civilization, which had become part of the Inca Empire. So Moche, here are some examples of these very fine Moche ceramics. Now, the question I want to ask today is, what can the Moche, and especially their ceramics, tell us about asymmetrical dependencies? And I'm going to talk briefly about the question of the ceramics today, and then talk about Moche society itself. So the ceramics today, as you are probably aware, in the US at least, there's now an enormous outcry about indigenous things that are in museums, which are represented as kind of colonized and imprisoned. Most of the Moche ceramics that I studied for this project are a great example. They're all looted objects that today are in museums and private collections. And this is a photograph I took looking out from this pyramid called Huaca El Brujo, out into the surrounding area. And those are all looters' pits where tombs have been disturbed and things have been removed. And so, you know, we have this critique, for instance, the Peruvian artist Cuculi Velarde, who does modern work that uses pre-Columbian imagery from the ceramics, talks about these pre-Columbian art on shelves as something that might be well taken care of, but they're trapped, they're estranged, stripped of meaning. So here's just a couple of paragraphs from the beginning of the book that's my response to that, or part of it. This book is about a group of ancient sexually explicit ceramics that I call the Moche sex pots. To a modern eye, these little works of art, which were created over 1,000 years ago on the north coast of Peru, are lively and provocative, but also baffling. It might seem impossible to imagine why they were made, or what the original owners thought or felt when they saw, touched, or held them. It's easy to assume that these indigenous objects have been silenced by their violent colonial history, ripped out of the ground by looters, sold to wealthy collectors, confined in glass cases, gawked at by uncomprehending strangers. The sex pots, we might say, have been reduced to mere curiosities. This book does not say anything of the kind. Instead, it asserts that there is much to be learned from spending time with these ancient things, which, simply through their stubborn materiality, continue to make the indigenous past a part of our contemporary lives. And in fact, one of the best examples of this, I think, is the work of contemporary artists like Cuculi Velarde, who goes on to talk about her own work, where she takes these pre-Columbian ceramics, but then she puts her own face on them. And she talks about how they all have my face, for I had to become each of them. No more passive pawns of their own history, they are us. So that's all I'm going to say really about the situation of the ceramics. We could certainly talk about it in discussion. Let's talk instead about Moche society. And here we have multiple interconnected asymmetrical dependencies: class, gender, age, and also human, non-human. Let's talk first about class. Moche society is a society where the wealthy class was exploding and very much showing off their wealth in all kinds of ways. So it's a society that's clearly dominated by a wealthy aristocracy or elite. At the same time that there are these fabulous tombs like this one, we see ordinary fisher people, farmers, buried in very simple, shallow graves with maybe one copper bead, something like that. The structure of this society is all around the flow of water. It's a very arid region, the north coast of Peru, and irrigation is the key to wealth and power. And during the Moche period, and especially the period when these ceramics were made, that I'll show you today, the irrigation system is expanding by thousands of kilometers. And there's still, this area is still a very wealthy agricultural area today, and they're still using the same system of irrigation canals originally built during this time. So power is in the flow of water, and there's a ceramic like this actually kind of represents the Moche world. So at the very top you see the mountains, the ice caps that are the source of water, and then down at the bottom the irrigated fields. These are the non-human sources of power in the Moche world. And then in between, the palace or the temple and the ancestral tombs, where we see this elite class kind of exerting or asserting its role in controlling that flow of wealth and of life. So that's class. Oops, sorry, I don't know why I did that. But let's talk also about gender. Now, this is a much more confusing story. What do the ceramics tell us about embodied asymmetries? The assumption for a long time has been that this is a society in which males dominate, and these portraits, heads of male leaders are often used as kind of an emblem of Moche society. But the evidence has gotten more and more complicated. As there have been more burials that are found by archaeologists that somehow escaped the looters, there are more and more powerful women who not only are buried with fabulous wealth, but also with the insignia of leadership. And this figure, the Lady of Cow, who you see here in a modern kind of recreation, who was buried with these military staffs, is an example of that. Also the priestesses of San Jose de Moro. So gender, it's kind of an open question now. One place where I've looked at this in the ceramics is that previous authors, male authors, have done a great deal to talk about phallic power and the raised fist. So they see sculptures like this where you see a man who's kind of, or a male figure who's kind of showing off his large erect penis, his exaggerated penis, and then raising his hand in this raised fist has been seen as emblematic of phallic power and thus of the power of men. But when I started doing the work, what I saw is that there's lots and lots of women, female figures, who also are kind of showing off or brandishing their genitalia, and they also have one or in some cases two raised fists. So it has made me question, and there's more I could say about this, but is there a Moche kind of phallic power or embodied power that is not solely associated with bodies that are identified as male at birth? And there's, like I said, more to say about this, but I think the ceramic record in some ways shows us the genitals as an emblem of power that's separable from the living male body. So in Moche elite society, what I'm going to maintain is that gender matters, but it is not as important as age. For Moche aristocrats, I think that age trumps gender, but our own hierarchy of embodied asymmetries makes this difficult for us to see. We tend to look to identify gender first. One of the first questions people always do when they're doing figurine analysis or analysis of ancient art is which are the males and which are the females, which are the men, which are the women. That's always the first question. And I'm not going to talk about them here, but some places do look for other models. where gender interacts with other forms of power, including age hierarchies, would be Ife Amadiume's work on Africa and Rosemary Joyce's wonderful work on the Maya. So it's really important to recognize as a starting point, not gender where we don't really know what the Moche had to say, but the very clear picture from the Andes that religion in the Andes is a form of ancestor worship, and that the figure of the ancestor is very, very important. Age. So age is more important than gender. I'm going to pursue this argument here through two cases. First, we'll look at some evidence from the sex pots, where I've been living for the last many years, and then a spectacular scene of violence. So let's look at the sex pots. In Moche fine ceramics, themes of sex and reproduction are very common. Here's some images of breastfeeding, of birth, and then there's all kinds of sex scenes involving animals, involving humans. Here's some that I'll be referring to more today. However, one of the mysteries that people have talked about a lot is that what seems to be missing is what we today think of as the reproductive sexual act. There are few, or I would argue no, pots that show a human penis penetrating a human vagina. Instead, as you can see here, the acts of sex that are represented are primarily oral and anal. So there's kind of an avoidance of that particular act. And in contrast to what's missing, what's very present are these skeletonized figures who have erect, active genitalia, male genitalia. Heterosexual anal sex is one of the most commonly portrayed acts, and surprisingly for modern viewers, there's often a nursing infant in these scenes. So you see an active anal penetration between two adults, and then there's a small child who is at the mother's breast. So how do we interpret this puzzling pattern? I think one danger for us is not to begin with assumptions about the heteronormative nuclear family. If we look instead and see what the Moche sex pots are actually saying, they're saying that reproduction is everywhere except in the bodies of young, sexually active heterosexual humans. They have a role to play, but they're not the key place in the way that we might think of it. So fertility in this canon of sex art is displaced from the genitals of young living couples, dispersed circulating between bodies, species, ecosystems. It's just everywhere. But I would argue that ultimately it's held, concentrated, and controlled by the massively fertile body of the ancestral dead. That's the origin place for humans. So generation is more important than gender. So what we see, if we really look at the way that these pots portray interactions, and especially the flow of vital fluids between bodies, we see the ancestral dead as the origin of fertility, living adult bodies as conduits for that fertility, and infants as the receptacles. So the ceramics are really talking a lot about the transmission of vitality and life and identity from the dead to the newly born through living adults. So the job of living adults is not to create new life, but to channel life that already exists and that has its origins outside of them, outside of their bodies. It's also important to look beyond the human. The ceramic vessels themselves are not representations of humans so much as they're embodied actors. So vital fluids flow between human and non-human bodies. Fluid passing between bodies transmits life between past and future generations. And in these ceremonies where these ceramics were used, which are ceremonies that took place in and around tombs, liquids move from fleshly bodies to ceramic bodies, from the pot's body into your body. And in the context of the tomb where these rituals were held, they're moving from the pot's body into your body and from the ancestor's body into your body. So the ceramics are crucial actors in this circulation of vital fluids within the kin group and between generations that starts with the dead and then passes through the ceramic bodies, which themselves, of course, have lifespans far longer than any human being, into the body of living descendants. But the ceramics are also key actors in the circulation of vital fluids between the kin group and non-human sources of life, and especially water. Bodies, ceramics, irrigation canals, all of these are clay tubes that hold and transmit vital fluids. So for Moche aristocrats, age is more important than gender. I've rushed through some evidence from the sex pots, which has been my particular area of interest. And now I want to turn to the kinds of scenes that have been much more the preoccupation of Moche scholars. And these are these spectacular scenes of violence. So I want to look particularly at one spectacular scene of violence, and for that, we've got to go back and think again about the environment. So the north coast of Peru is an arid environment in which water brings life, wealth, and power, but it's also an environment in which water brings death and destruction. So this is one of the places where, and so the El Nino Southern Oscillation hits the hardest, right? So there's these episodic, unpredictable events in which cold water is displaced from the Humboldt Current by a southward intrusion of warm water. And what that means on the north coast is torrential rains, flooding, the disruption of habitats. So it's just this incredibly destructive thing that happens pretty regularly. So in response, it has been argued, the Moche performed this gruesome rite of sacrifice. So this was this finding at Huaca de la Luna, one of the most important pyramids that's full of temples and burials and was used and reused for many hundreds of years. But within it, in a kind of enclosed patio, an archaeologist named Steve Bourget found this incredible scene of dismembered bodies and shattered ceramics that were mixed together and then left exposed for this mud that must have been coming in from torrential rain. So his explanation is that there was an El Nino event, people were panicking, and so they sacrificed a bunch of people and also ceramics in an effort to kind of appease the gods or in some kind of a way to avert this catastrophe. So it's a very striking find, of course. Now, conventional explanations for events like this are problematic, and I haven't completely worked my way through what I think about them, but I want to say that they emphasize ignorance, they emphasize manipulative leaders, and they emphasize the terror of the populace, right? So this one, two of these images here are modern recreations of the Moche, but the other one is from the movie Apocalypto, which you might remember, which was a kind of reimagining of Maya life, but it's very typical also of representations of the Moche, where you have a leader standing on top of an enormous pyramid. The masses are gathered down below. There's a promise that he can change the world, that he is a living God. And then there's these gruesome physical bloody sacrifices. And images of the Moche, and including of the Lady of Kao, for which there's no particular evidence for this, are often shown as doing this kind of thing, standing in front of these masses of people and killing people. So the image here, which comes from sort of 19th century evolutionary theory, is of priest kings, theocrats, terrorizing ignorant peasants through these gruesome acts of violence. And the find at Huaca de la Luna can be seen as kind of exemplifying that. But I would argue, I'm not the only person to say this, but these kinds of explanations are themselves an example of an asymmetrical relationship. They kind of exemplify the asymmetrical relationship between Western scholars and the non-Western past or the archaeological record. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not the only person to say this. This wonderful book by Severin Fowles he goes through that history, and he has examples like this. Sir John Lubbock in 1865 saying the religion of ancient Peru was a religion of terror, a terrible scourge of humanity. Joanna Brooke is someone who's talked eloquently about this. She talks about how a division between rationality and irrationality has been mapped onto the division between Western and non-Western societies as part of the legitimizing discourse of European colonialism. So, the model that we kind of inherited is that science is control over nature, whereas religion is a pretense at controlling nature by people who actually can't control it. They're not using technology. Instead, they're pretending that they can just call upon the gods through some kind of ritual. And then the political aspect of this is that this pretense at controlling nature is used by leaders to control a human population through violence, through terror, through ritual. And this, of course, is a kind of traditional explanation of theocratic societies, and certainly been used to explain the Moche. But one thing I want to say about it, first of all, is we are more dubious right now about science and technology as the way to control nature. So that aspect of this has come under somewhat under question as an interest in indigenous technologies. And certainly the Moche are an example of a society where their ability to control water, and despite these frequent El Niños, to just thrive and grow and build upon previous successes is really impressive. And it's something we could look at now when these kind of natural disasters are becoming more and more common. So instead of seeing them as kind of failures who are manipulative and ignorant, I think we could more usefully look and see what they were doing that obviously worked quite well for many millennia. And also the evidence itself doesn't really support that kind of vision. There's some really interesting new archaeological work done by people like the Peruvian archaeologist Ari Caramanica or the American geographer Ben Vining that shows that if you look out in the surrounding areas beyond these pyramids and beyond the central precincts, you can see that these events were catastrophic for elites, but not necessarily for ordinary people. In fact, for ordinary people, they may in some ways have been kind of amazing because previous agricultural systems were destroyed, but then new areas that had been arid get opened up because new forms of lakes and springs and so forth suddenly emerge. So Carmanica and Vining argue that ordinary people were suddenly able to farm in places they hadn't been able to farm before. So those floods, earthquakes, sandstorms, evulsions, they threaten to destroy the sources of elite wealth and power. They're very destructive for that. But for ordinary people, it could actually be a freeing where they're able to move beyond those agricultural systems that were controlled by elites and establish new places. So it's not so much a natural disaster in the way that it's often thought of as it is a disruption in the system of asymmetrical dependencies and specifically of class. And also, if you look at that horrific sacrifice scene, and you look at the spatial and architectural evidence, this is clearly not something that was designed to be seen by the masses. The masses are clearly not there. It's a very small enclosed space within an entirely elite sanctuary and burial place. And ultimately, I think the evidence in the ceramics is quite telling and very interesting. And Boucher, who I'm critical of in other places, but he writes beautifully about this because he points out that these ceramics were mixed in with these dismembered bodies of young men, and they themselves seem to represent the young men. He's even speculated that they might be portraits of them because every one of these is different. The faces are different, and he makes a big deal about how the penises are different too. But also they're not really represented like typical prisoners. They're very calm, their hands are relaxed, their arms are unbound, their faces are stoic, and they're covered with the ornamentation of elite bodies. So these are these beautiful aristocratic bodies that we see so often in the ceramics that were owned by elites. But there's some really critical differences. So I should say also that his team did a phenomenal job reconstructing these, which had been completely shattered and intermixed with mud and with bones. So I would say that what this evidence suggests is not a ritual designed to terrify the masses by elites who cynically maybe don't believe it. Instead, what you see is young elite men being asked to give their lives to preserve the elite social order. And who knows how they actually felt, but in the ceramics, they're represented as doing this kind of calmly, willingly, right? Now, there's two final pieces of evidence that are quite telling. One is that these are unfired figurines. So they're destined for this single performance. They were made beautifully, but they were made and not fired because they're only going to be seen once. They're only going to be seen at this moment of destruction. And also, these are figurines. So every other Moche fine ceramic is a vessel. It's a functional vessel that can hold liquid, and so it has a spout, basically. But these are not. These are figurines. They're completely closed. And so for us, by contemporary or sort of 18th, 19th century artistic canons, the figurine that's so beautiful might seem better than a mere vessel, which is just a craft item and not a fine art item. But I think here the reverse is true. These are sad and tragic things. They're closed bodies that can only be shattered. They're going to die, and they're going to die forever because all the vital liquid will leave them, and they can never interact with another body in a whole state ever again. And in contrast, we might think that these ones are weird and awkward and not so beautiful, but I think these ones emphasize that their bodies are open. These are open bodies that can continue to give and receive and to interact with the living, including even potentially today. I mean, they've lived for 1,000 years, and they're still going strong, and they have all these openings to the world. So open bodies that can give and receive and thus can live forever. So to conclude, the question male or female is still an interesting one to ask, and there's lots more to say about it. But what I've seen overall is the Moche artists depicting genital difference, bodily difference, but also always making the similarities more important than the differences. I think where they're interested in portraying difference is things like this, examples like this, where you see them interested in portraying the difference between the dead who live and the young who die. So, and I think they're doing that in support of a gerontocratic system of asymmetrical dependencies that valued elites over commoners, elders over youth, and the ancestors and the gods over all. Thank you.